Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football, teaming up with SG1 Sports to provide the most insightful college football debate, discussion, and analysis you will find anywhere online. Got Steve Merrill on the line from Pro Sports Info. Steve joined us a number of times and tried to get him in here on a regular basis each and every week to set us up for the college football games each and every Friday. And then also we took it through the NFL playoffs and the Super Bowl, and it was a whole lot of fun because this is fascinating to most sports fans, college football fans, and certainly myself. So, Steve, how you been?
Doing well, Mark. And yeah, NBA playoffs are finished. We're kind of in the slow part of the summer here with baseball and starting to look at college football, believe it or not. And the NFL preseason starts in less than 2 months.
Yeah, betting on preseason sports in any arena just goes way beyond anything that I would try to approach there. The Heisman Trophy you could probably put in the same bucket because you're not just determining what the outcome is going to be of something that you can actually watch and determine with a scoreboard, but basically predicting what others are going to select. Of course, is the issue there with the Heisman Trophy, and it's not real surprising. Right at the top of the Heisman Trophy board and the odds of who's placed there. Although, if you go down the list a little bit, I've got some issues with some other guys. But how does it look right now?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the odds are going to vary from book to book, but pretty much the top two right now. Some have Bryce Love as a slight favorite over Jonathan Taylor. I have seen Jonathan Taylor a slight favorite in some books, but basically Stanford running back Bryce Love right now is the favorite, followed by Wisconsin running back Jonathan Taylor. And it's unusual because historically, as you know, Mark, quarterbacks win the Heisman. But we have seen running backs become a little more viable recently. And isn't it crazy in the modern era of college football where the running game is less important than it's ever been, that we have two running backs as the preseason favorites to win the Heisman? Quite fascinating, I think.
Yeah, that is a good point, and you don't have to go too far down the list. At least I'm checking out the Bovada rundown to see a quarterback who has yet to throw a pass in major college football.
That's right.
That's Trevor Lawrence of Clemson, and of course, Clemson is considered to be arguably the best team in the country, certainly in the top 3 or 4. And to determine that the starting quarterback's out and that a new kid, regardless of the talent and the expectations, is already this high in the Heisman Trophy race seems to be not something that I would go out and invest my money in.
Yeah, I'm seeing him around 16 to 1. I see him at 18 to 1 in another book. What's crazy about this is a couple years ago, he would have been 50 to 1. But here's the thing. I can name 2 quarterbacks within the last decade that have won the Heisman that had never thrown a pass entering the season. Johnny Manziel and Cam Newton both did it. In fact, they weren't even listed as the starting quarterback in some preseason annuals those seasons, and they won the Heisman. You could have had monster odds if you even found odds on them before the year started. So things have definitely changed. I think the odds makers have caught on to that. And as you mentioned, we've got 2 Alabama quarterbacks in the top 20 or 30 odds. They're both less than 50 to 1. So there's some crazy things that have happened with college football. We see the dual quarterbacks. We see different quarterbacks. Jake Fromm isn't necessarily going to be the starter the entire season. Who knows what could happen to Georgia? I find that the reason I think we have 2 running backs as the favorites this year is because there's so much uncertainty with that quarterback group that we're talking about.
Then you could also make the case that although not winning the Heisman Trophy, Jameis Winston, without ever having thrown a pass, of course, led his team to a national championship. Sure. And Tua Tagovailoa, to a lesser degree, saved the season for Alabama as a freshman last season, and certainly is a major impact on the odds coming into the season, as you just allude to, with Jalen Hurts most likely the odd man out. I think people might be overreacting to the great display in fourth quarter and overtime for Tua, but the other guy that draws some attention here in regards to inexperience would be Dwayne Haskins of Ohio State. Came into the Michigan game, performed rather well, but threw 8 passes. So here's a guy with 8 passes under his belt. Played some mop-up duty elsewhere, but basically under fire just the one quarter at the Big House. And but based on the talent around him and the opportunity, that's what serves up the odds the way they stand.
I think, with the Heisman, what I like to do, and we've talked about this before, really with any future odds, whether it's national championship, Heisman Trophy, any sport, when your money's going to be tied up now until basically December, we're talking about over 6 months that you make this bet now in Vegas or anywhere else, you're paying up front. So they're holding your money for 6 months. So not only Are you not having that in your daily rotation of your bankroll for the whole season? Is it really worth, tying your money up for a 7-1 or an 8-1 payout? I think you want to look at long shots for that reason. The other reason also is because you don't have to bet as much on a long shot. A 50-1 long shot, you don't have to bet as much to win the same amount as you do at 7-1, and your money once again is being tied up for 6 months. Historically, long shots win the Heisman. It hasn't happened the last few seasons, but as I referenced, Johnny Manziel, Cam Newton. I'll never forget back in November a few years ago, Robert Griffin was 100-1 a couple weeks before the Heisman, and he still won that year. Andrew Luck was an overwhelming favorite with a few weeks left in the season. So in general, with futures and especially the Heisman, you want to take more long shot approaches. I think Jalen Hurts at 50-1 is really interesting because he was much lower last year when the season began. But between him and Tua, no matter who you like there, if they do both play, it's going to hurt their numbers. And also, Alabama isn't exactly a pass-happy offense. So I'd stay away probably from the Alabama quarterbacks for that reason. I do like quarterbacks in general. I'm looking a little farther down the list here. Let's go, at least 20-1 or longer shots. Jake Browning, 22-1, the Washington quarterback. I think they'll win their division this year. The Pac-12 has at least 3 or 4 new coaches, Arizona, Arizona State, Chip Kelly at UCLA. So I think those teams could start slow. And Washington might have an easier path this year in the Pac-12 than in years past. The problem, of course, is that these West Coast teams often don't get the attention that the East Coast and other big conferences get from the national voters.
Steve Merrill from Pro Sports Info joining us to break down the Heisman odds and anything else we can get to in the next few minutes concerning college football odds for the 2018 season. And Steve, you beat me to the punch with Jake Browning. As soon as I saw Haskins there around 22-1, I saw Browning right next to him. And considering, that this is a player who has a wealth of experience, who's already led his team to a college football playoff, that plays in a relatively weak conference for a near elite program that looks to have one of the safer paths to the college football playoff. The odds are stacked against every specific team for the most part. But for a particular situation, it doesn't come much better than Jake Browning there at Washington. Have you had a chance to look at national championship odds? Of course, Alabama would be the front runner, I would think. Clemson, Ohio State not far behind.
Yeah, I mean, my preseason prediction for some of the annuals and other publications I've been working on, they ask national title picks. I've got Alabama against Ohio State, obviously not going out on a limb there, but I think they're probably the 2 most talented teams in the country. Ohio State, I think, has a little bit of an easier path maybe in the Big Ten than Alabama does. Obviously, having Georgia in the other divisions, once again, good for Alabama. They wouldn't meet until the championship game. They could kind of play out basically like it did last year, and I think it very well could again. Once again, though, with these futures, I'd like to look down the list a bit. I think Florida State's an interesting team with Willie Taggart taking over. I'm not even sure they'll win their division. I think Clemson and Miami of Florida probably win the 2 divisions in the ACC. But if you're looking for a possible sleeper talent-wise, Florida State has it. And Taggart's the kind of guy that can turn things around. He got in trouble at Oregon last year for these boot camp-style workouts. So I don't think that'll be a soft team anymore like it might have been under Jimbo Fisher. But another sleeper for me, a team I actually have picked to win the Big 12, which I think will be really down this year overall as a conference. But once again, you win the Big 12, you got a pretty good chance of being in that 14 playoff. And don't forget, Mark, all we need is to get in the 14 playoff because you can always hedge at that point if you have a longer shot team. And I like Texas. I'm seeing them at 35-1 at some sports books. I think Texas has the best defense in that conference. Tom Herman is a great coach. He's had a few years now at that school. As a sleeper, at 30-1 or longer, I think Texas has some value for those future odds.
Steve Merrill joining us from Pro Sports Info. Please join him there for his odds, not just on college football, but the NFL, baseball, basketball, all the way across the board. And Steve, just having you on here, I must be getting smarter because every time you spit out a team or a player, I'm right on board with you with Texas, considering what they accomplished last year, not just in regards to the wins and losses, but they competed. Double overtime loss at USC, overtime loss at Oklahoma State, who was a second kind of front runner for the Big 12 and only within 1 score of Baker Mayfield in Oklahoma. And of course, that's always a neutral site game. So Texas looks to be possibly a good selection there. Steve, it has to be so much different in looking at the NFL versus college football because I keep hearing about it being more difficult to establish a dynasty in college football than it was back in the 40s and 50s and 60s. But I don't know. There looks to be 3 programs, maybe 4 if you throw in Georgia, that seem to be the elite of college football. Alabama, Clemson, Ohio State, possibly Georgia. Then there's a really good tier after that. But those programs seem to be, if one of those four teams don't win the national championship, I'm going to be slightly surprised, versus the NFL that's just a wide open race each and every year, despite the Patriots' consistency over 15 years.
Yeah, and the thing about the NFL is we have more parity than we've ever had. In fact, basically every other year, different teams make the playoffs. In fact, I saw a stat last year, and being no longer a Redskin fan, and I somewhat got back into the Washington Capitals this year in the finals. But I'd written all these teams off several years ago, and emotionally, it's been made my life a lot more pleasant. But the Redskins were only like one of 3 or 4 teams that hadn't made the playoffs in the last like 3 or 4 years. That's just basically every year, a team makes the NFL playoffs, then misses the playoffs. We saw it last year at the Eagles. They come out of nowhere, they win the Super Bowl. They were an underdog in every single playoff game, including all their home games and the Super Bowl. And that was with the backup quarterback. They've got basically everybody back this season. But then the Minnesota Vikings go and sign Kirk Cousins, speaking of the Redskins. And Minnesota was a road favorite at Philadelphia in that championship game. So, you always see these favorites, but it just never plays out that way. And like you said, Mark, the New England Patriots have been only the one consistent factor basically in the NFL over the past decade. And that's because of Belichick and Brady. He has to stay healthy. They no longer have the backup in Garoppolo. And you do feel like at some point maybe that's going to come back to bite them. And speaking of future odds right now, the 49ers are the 6th or 7th team on the board at a lot of sports books to win the Super Bowl at 20-1. So that's how much of a difference a quarterback can make for you. And they basically were unbeatable in the final month of the season with Garoppolo in the lineup there. I'm not sold on San Francisco. I'm not sure they're going to win the whole thing, but we saw Minnesota and Philadelphia really turn things around last year. You got to wonder if maybe the 49ers are the sleeper team this year. My 2 predictions for a lot of the annuals I've been doing has been New England and Green Bay. Once again, not going out on a limb. Packers, though, did underachieve last year, so I think the Packers could be a bit of a play-on team this year, and they have a great quarterback as well.
Yeah, I like to play this game with some people from time to time when I throw out kind of a wild card team in the NFL that could possibly, when I mean wild card, not specifically the wild card game, but
Right.
just a wild card at the beginning of the season. Because if I'm not mistaken, the Eagles went something like 6-10 the year before. So take your 5-11 to 7-9 teams in the NFL and try to pick a team that's going to win the Super Bowl this year. And if you just start throwing those out to your standard NFL fan, they think it's utterly ridiculous that one of those teams is going to win the Super Bowl this year, but it happens every few years.
It does. And obviously the odds makers realize that because San Francisco would normally not be a 20-1 team based on their recent record, so the value's gone there, kind of like we talked about with Clemson, a young quarterback. They've caught on to that with the Heisman odds as well. A couple teams I'll throw out. Basically, quarterback dictates the NFL now more than it ever has. Houston Texans, 25-1. They're in the top 8 or 10 at most sports books. That means they should be a playoff team. They were about as bad as anybody in the league last year offensively without Deshaun Watson, and they're about as good as anybody in the league offensively with him. He's healthy again. He's back. And obviously they can compete if they had that same type of offense this year. The concern I would have, though, is the sophomore slump, or the fact that maybe teams start to figure him out like they did with Robert Griffin after his strong season with the Redskins. He never quite had the same numbers. But I think the Houston Texans, San Francisco 49ers, because of the strength of quarterback that they have not had in past years, would be 2 of those teams. And another team, Mark, last year, don't forget about the Eagles, as you said. What about the Jacksonville Jaguars? They hadn't won more than 4 games in several years, and they almost go to the Super Bowl last year.
Yeah, had a 10-point lead with about 7 or 8 minutes left against New England, of course, in trying to get to the Super Bowl. So, Steve, if I'm trying to make sense out of this in regards to the predictions, see, I did this last year. I took most of the major college football teams. I actually did take all the Power 5 teams, and I lined up their schedule. And instead of predicting the games, I gave a win probability just based on, it was just a gut instinct. So if Clemson's playing Pitt, Clemson should win that game, but they're not going to win the game 100 times in a row. They're going to win it maybe 85 or 90 times, and I was just trying to put a probability on that. So basically, are you making a prediction of Alabama, Ohio State, or Packers, Patriots, or is that just kind of the chalk probability of what should happen?
Yeah, for me, that's more not factoring in the schedule strength. That's really just who I think are 2 of the more talented teams in the league. I think Green Bay, when healthy with Aaron Rodgers, can beat anybody in the NFC. And as we know, New England's been the dominant team over the past decade. And I think in college football, Alabama and Ohio State are the 2 best teams heading in talent-wise. So assuming they win their conferences, they have a pretty good path to the playoff. But as far as future betting, I'm not sure I would play any of those teams. As I mentioned earlier, You're tying your money up for 6, 7 months. You're not getting a huge payoff. I would rather play a longer shot in the NFL and especially in college football, a team you think can make the playoffs in the NFL or a team you think can make the playoffs in college football that are at double-digit prices. And then you can always hedge out. I don't think Texas will win the national title, but I think they can win the Big 12, which means they have a very good shot of being in the Final Four. We talked about Washington. How about USC, 45-1? They can win their division in the Pac-12, which gives them a shot to get into the playoff. And, at 45-1 or 35-1, you can start to hedge out. And I think those are safer plays. NFL, I would look at maybe San Francisco or Houston at 25-1 or the Dallas Cowboys in double-digit range because I think those teams are capable of making the playoffs and maybe making a run.
We've got Steve Merrill on the line from Pro Sports Info. Please join him there for his analysis and his predictions and so forth regarding all the sports. Steve, with the advanced metrics, I would think that on one hand that the fan has somewhat caught up with Vegas if he's willing to invest the time and really is understanding of the metrics, but at the same time, Las Vegas has those same metrics available to them and knows how to use them. So has there been any swing in recent years over in terms of whether the average Joe has been able to maybe catch up a little bit or maybe it's worked in reverse?
Two ways to look at it. There's more information than ever for the average bettor, as you mentioned. However, the odds makers have the same information as well. And I think the lines are sharper than they've ever been. A perfect example is actually something we talked about at the top of the segment was the preseason football. I've been doing this for 21 years. I started in 1996 as a full-time professional handicapper. I was doing it since the early 90s. Preseason football in the 1990s was one of the best money makers ever, especially when the internet hit in the mid-90s, because you could get all the online newspapers. You literally could find out a coach's game plan, his rotation, his quarterback rotation, and you would really kind of know how the game was going to play out. And it took several years for everyone to catch on to that. But nowadays, everybody knows the quarterback rotations. The odds makers adjust at the minute the news comes out. And for that reason, I find less spots now in preseason football than I found maybe 15 or 20 years ago. So you always have to kind of ebb and flow with the information change. And there's no question about it. This isn't like the 70s or 80s when guys would wait at McCarran Airport in Las Vegas for flights to come in and go get the newspapers off of them so they could get inside information from local cities. We all have that at the click of a mouse now. So I do think the game has changed. I think that average, bettor has more information than ever, but you still have to know what to do with it. And as always, you can get paralysis from overanalysis. So I use some tried and true handicapping techniques. I use a lot of emotion, situational matchups, especially in college football, where it's very difficult for 19 and 20-year-old kids to have their A game every week. So you always look for those letdown spots, those flat spots, and look ahead spots. And that's stuff that's very difficult, I think, for metrics and numbers to simulate still, the human emotional edge.
Yeah, it seems like Vegas, of course, knows this, and they run the numbers, and they know what they mean behind it. And a guy like you, but we all seem to overreact to week one results in any sport, especially football, of course. And somebody looks like a world beater because they went out and beat a good team by 2 touchdowns, but then they come back down to earth, and we react the other way typically on the other side. I don't know if anybody's taken the time to run the numbers, but with all the numbers that are run by the likes of you and others, maybe this has been run and means something, but I've always wondered, there are the folks out there that I talk to that just think Vegas has a lock on everything, that they just know what's going to happen, and they'll point to specific scores and say, man, Ohio State just beat Michigan by 3 and the line was 3.5. See, Vegas, man, they just know everything. And then other people who think, oh, I can beat Vegas, I can do it. Do we have any indication, whether it be in college or the NFL, how close is Vegas to hitting the line? Like if you would take the entire NFL season, which I believe is 256 games, how many times is Vegas within a point? What percentage of the time are they within 3 points, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? Do we have any?
Well, I'll give you an example. In basketball, you can do a teaser bet where you can move the line by 4 points, and you have to play 2 teams. You can move them both 4 points in your favor, but the catch is you have to hit both games. And that about 70% of the time, an NBA game or a college basketball game is going to land within 4 points, which is 2 baskets of the point spread, 70% of the time. So that's how accurate the numbers are. Football is a little bit of a different beast because you have the key scoring margins like 3 and 7. About 18% of the time, a football team is going to win by exactly 3 points. The favorite's going to win by 9 or 10% of the time by 3. So, yeah, when you see a team win by 3.5, the line's 3.5, they win by 3. 1 out of 10 times mathematically that should happen actually, just due to the nature of the scoring of football. 7 would be the next, most important margin. But then on top of that, as you said earlier, we have more mathematical information than we've ever had. So these lines are very sharp, and that's why money management and discipline is the key to winning long term. Yes, picking winners is important, and I have an edge and I apply that. But if you're not using proper money management, if you're not shopping for that extra half point, like you just said, get 3 instead of laying 3.5, that makes a big difference, even no matter who you're picking. And that's something that the amateur bettor normally doesn't focus on. That's what the professional bettors do focus on.
Yeah, I'm trying to think how I tracked this one particular season, but I was looking at college football and thinking, what would be the advantage of having accounts with, let's say, 8 or 10 sports books versus just having an account with one, and then
Sure.
always playing the line that was most in favor of your prediction. So, for
Yeah.
example, you think Ohio State is going to beat the spread against Michigan, and the line's like 6 or 5.5 across the board, but you're able to jump out and grab well, if you're taking Ohio State over Michigan, you're grabbing the lowest line. Let's say there's a 5 out there, and so you grab that instead of the 5.5 or the 6. How many times that comes into play? And based on how I figured it, it seemed to be an increase in your money of like 7 or 8%.
Correct. You're exactly right. In fact, I tell people there are 3 elements to being a winning sports bettor: money management, shopping for line value, and then picking the right team. And the order I just listed, those are the order of importance. Money management's number one. Yeah, and the extreme example is if you bet 100% of your bankroll on every play and you go 99-1, you still go broke. And obviously that's a crazy example, but it just shows money management's the most important thing. But second is line value. You don't even have to pick the right team, because exactly what you're talking about. If you had 8 or 10 sets of lines for every game and said, hey, look, I'm just going to play the favorite in every Big Ten game all season, and you were getting that extra half point, which you would by having the best possible number, you only have to hit 52.4% to break even, laying 11-10. You will win an extra 2, 3, 4%, like you just said, by getting that extra half point every game, and you will win automatically without picking a single game or handicapping a single game. That's how important it is, and it's for the exact reason you touched on earlier. The lines are sharper than they've ever been. So then you factor in a handicapping edge like I have for my clients, then you increase that win percentage by more than just 3 or 4% above break even. But you're exactly right. Money management and shopping for line value, most important aspects of sports betting, and it's what most amateurs don't do. The example I give, Mark, if you have just a second set of numbers, just a second sportsbook account, you have a 50% better chance of getting a better number on every single play you make all season by having a second account as opposed to just one. Now, if you have 3 or 4, it's exponentially less each time, but you obviously have a better chance as well. But 2 is a no-brainer. Probably 3 at a minimum is what you should have.
Yeah, I was also tracking baseball 2 particular seasons, and after this, I'll let you go. I know you got a lot going on, but it was shocking to see that in just looking at the straight odds for baseball games, not going into the 1.5 runs per game, is that the underdog wins like close to 40% of the time in Major League Baseball.
Yeah, that's a good point, because you can play the run line, which is plus 1.5. It's kind of like a point spread for baseball, but you're usually laying minus money at that, or you could take the underdog straight up at plus money. And yeah, most of the time that 1.5 run doesn't necessarily come into play. But that's another perfect example about discipline and money management. Baseball is a totally different sport because you're playing plus money underdogs. You can hit 45% for the season and win, because you don't have to win every other game when you're getting plus money. But for the average bettor that wants to win every day or win every play, it's very difficult for them to take that long-term approach. But yeah, baseball is a great sport, mathematically speaking, and also money management speaking, because there's twice as many baseball games as any other sport. Hockey and basketball combined in the NBA and NFL and NHL have as many games as baseball. Baseball has 15 games a day on average. The NFL has 15 games in a whole week. So you're talking about 7 NFL weeks in 1 week of baseball. And it just shows why there's a lot of profit potential, but also why you have to have the right money management approach.
Yeah, and the other psychological thing that it comes into play with the people that I talk to that just throw the money around a little bit at whatever flashes in front of them is obviously the bigger the game, the more psychological that plays into it, that you feel that because it's a big game, you're going to play more money on
Right.
that game, and that's where your attention's going to go, and that may not be the value.
Right. And the Super Bowl is a perfect example. We talked about that during the Super Bowl show this past February. It's the biggest bet event of the year, but it's only one game. And there's not really much value normally in the Super Bowl. Now, the props, the props are a different story because there's hundreds of them. But the side or total in the Super Bowl, all the information is known. There's no secrets out there. Sometimes there's value, sometimes there's not. I'd prefer to have 15 NFL games on a regular Sunday to pick from. But the public loves those big events. The one advantage you do have sometimes in these big public events, though, is that there's a lot of square money coming in that moves the line more than it would, say, like on a small conference college basketball game where only sharp bettors are playing it.
So keep that in mind, folks, that if you really are serious about this and want to gain some information, your garden variety Brewers Pirates game on a Thursday afternoon holds just as much value potentially as the Super Bowl. The betting lines don't value the games that way.
Yeah.
All right, Steve Merrill from Pro Sports Info, doing a great job. We appreciate, Steve, you educating us here at Mark Rogers TV.
Thanks, Mark. Enjoyed it.